Let's begin with uh, a very exciting Landmark Ideas series that we have today. I'm very, very pleased to be here for a conversation with Rich Miner, who is the co-founder of Android. He's at Google now in several interesting roles there. I direct the Computational Health Informatics program at Boston Children's Hospital. We were founded in 1994. It's a multidisciplinary applied research and education program, and you can learn more about us at www.chip.org. This Landmark Ideas series is an event that features thought leaders across healthcare, informatics, IT, big science, innovation, and more. If you're interested in talking about the talk on social media, here are some handles for Rich, Boston Hospital Computational Health Informatics Program, and mine. We're going to introduce Dr. Miner briefly, then we're going to have our fireside chat. Please put your questions in the Zoom Q&A box as we go, and I will try to wrangle those into our conversation, and then we'll have some brief closing remarks. So Rich has been helping to build innovative technologies and companies with global impact for almost 40 years. He's a co-founder of Android, the world's most popular operating system with over 3 billion active users. After selling Android to Google in 2005 and launching the first few releases, he co-founded Google Ventures, Google's first venture fund. And we're going to get into more of his background as we begin our talk. And let me stop sharing and jump in with Rich now. So, Rich, before we dig in to the headline of Android, that was not your first rodeo. What's your background, your education, other startups before that might have prepared you for that kind of insight and success?
Sure. And hey, everybody, and thanks for not reading that large block of text. I got a little worried. So yeah, well, I don't get referred to as Dr. Miner that often here in a largely medical audience. I guess it's a little bit more common, but I do have a PhD in computer science. Before that, grew up in the Boston area. And we'll talk about this maybe later, but was kind of weaned on Star Trek and TV dinners in my youth. Played with lasers in my bedroom. Had a little sandbox with a laser and some optical components, and tried to make holograms. That sandbox was sitting on an inner tube and some cinder blocks to try and have it vibration isolated. So geeked out in high school a little bit, and then started in physics. That list lasted for a week or two before I decided I didn't want to be a physicist, and kind of begged my way into the computer science department, and then up at UMass Lowell, and stayed at UMass Lowell through my bachelor's, master's, and PhD. Did some innovative projects there that were on the kind of leading edge of tech, but not long-term research, kind of close to being able to be commercialized. We had a lab that had that sort of philosophy. In that lab, worked with an entrepreneur, Boston-based entrepreneur called Bill Warner, who Bill was at Apollo and just leaving Apollo to start a company called Avid Technology, which built the world's first non-linear video editing system. So today, cutting and pasting video on a computer, that's pretty much what most people know. But prior to the mid 80s, or late 80s, early 90s, the primary way you edited video was either cutting film with a pair of scissors and splicing it together, or patching videotapes together with lots of decks of videotapes, copying from one tape to another tape. A very lossy process, actually. And so anyway, so Bill started Avid. Most of the movies in the 90s were edited on Avid video editing systems, Titanic, et cetera. Helped him incubate that in our lab, didn't join Avid, but then with Bill started a company called Wildfire Communications. And Wildfire built the first voice-based personal assistant. So when you say, and I've got to be careful saying this because I'm probably going to wake up a bunch of things in my room here, but when you say, hey, Google, to wake up your Google Assistant, or you say, hey, Alexa, to talk to Amazon Alexa, I have a patent from 1994 for the wake-up word for voice-based assistants. So assistive interfaces, collaborative assistive interfaces to help you get things done with your voice. That's something that, you know, we started Wildfire in 1991 to do that. We ultimately sold that to Orange, the European mobile phone company, who had a vision to basically put that assistant, you know, within the phone and within the phone network. And Orange, soon after that, got acquired by France Telecom, which had a similar vision, but couldn't execute quite as quickly, being a larger government-originated phone company. But so did the voice assistant. That was at this large mobile phone company where, among other things, I was driving innovation and also started a corporate venture fund called Orange Ventures. One thing I did there was help launch the first Windows mobile phone, which was one of the first smartphones that ran a version of Microsoft Windows operating system called Windows Mobile. Orange was the first company, the first carrier to launch a Windows mobile phone. And I got concerned through that process that Microsoft was going to control that platform too much, and we'd seen them control the PC space, where there's one word processing app, there's one slide creation app, and I was really concerned if Microsoft owned this mobile phone platform and it became very popular, that would be another platform that Microsoft would own and maybe exclude others. And so we invested in a few startups that were building open mobile phone OSs, one of them here in the Boston area called Savage, that was a spin out from AT&T Bell Labs, that was building an OS based on Java, a mobile phone OS based on Java. And then I also invested in Andy Rubin's company, Danger, which was building this cool mobile data device. And Andy ended up, that company Danger did okay. It was ultimately bought by Microsoft. But with Andy, I ended up starting at a later date, starting Android. So anyways, that's a little bit of my my history and background.
So, you know, many antecedents there to Android, and also some interesting thinking about the space and control, closed versus open. So how did that then funnel into the origin story for Android itself, and you know, and how did that come together?
Yeah, I'll give you a few examples of the kinds of interactions we had with Microsoft that kind of made the hair on the back of my neck stand up a little bit. When, you know, for instance, so again, Orange was the only carrier that had agreed to launch this you know, Windows OS at this point. We were working with HTC to build the first Windows Mobile smartphone. It was called the SPV, for sound, video, and pictures. It was a candy bar phone. So if anybody remembers those kind of phones, it was kind of a long phone with a physical numeric keypad and a little screen above it. But it had some, you know, it had messaging and it had the ability to have apps on it. And so we would tell Microsoft, you know, we were Orange. Orange had great branding with, you know, Orange being a core part of their branding. And we would say, geez, we need background images that are kind of orange and match our, and they're like, oh no, we have the Windows Start menu and the Windows Start background, right? And then all of our phones also had an IP-based messaging system based on a standard called IMPP. And we told Microsoft, oh, we need to put a messaging app on our phone that's IMPP based. And they're like, no, we have MSN Messenger. You don't need to have your messaging app. And so seeing that rigidity just made me concerned that you needed a platform that was open. Clearly, it needed to have app support, but it needed to be extensible and be able to be kind of iterated and influenced by the carriers and by the handset OEMs. And so Andy Rubin, who, as I mentioned, I'd invested in his company, Danger, Andy had left Danger and prior to it being acquired, but he wanted to build something new. And Andy started Android to actually build an OS for cameras. His thinking was cameras were going to have smarter processors in them and location, and that some combination of that you might want to, there was the need for an OS that could have some apps inside the camera. He went up and down Sand Hill Road, couldn't get funding for that idea, even though he was an EIR at Redpoint. And so I started chatting with him about the time that he realized, no, this really should be about a mobile phone OS. That's what we need. And I had my experience with both Microsoft and my experience with this other startup, Savage. And so we just started talking about, how do we build something that's open, that empowers carriers, that empowers handset OEMs. We very early on, the thought was that it should be an open OS. We had a revenue model that we had thought early on where we were going to have this open OS, and Andy was going to build that with a team on the West Coast where they could easily get to Asia and talk to a lot of the handset OEMs. I was going to build a team in Boston that was going to build a platform for the network that was going to let carriers build services, photo book in the cloud, contact list in the cloud, ringtone downloads. Anyway, so we had a business plan, we had startup ideas, we started to pitch VCs. We had a demo team of about 7 to 9 people, and started building Android.
So what year was this? Where's Apple and its iPhone at this point?
Yeah, this is 2004, and Apple maybe about that time had just started to internally and very secretively think about an iPhone, but that didn't come onto our radar until, the press had started to get little leaks about it and talk about it several years later. So we were building this, I first started talking to Andy in late 2004, but then it was a very quick path from there to Google acquiring us in July of 2005.
So, and then from the, interesting that, it started off, imagined for a camera, when it turns out in the end, these are our cameras now. That was another disruptive innovation, was to see cameras coming up in our phones and taking the incumbent companies slowly but surely by surprise, right? I'm sure that Canon and Nikon in those early days of the little plastic lens cameras and phones were not very worried about their business models. But so there were multiple strains of disruptive innovation going on here.
Not just cameras that have been, completely disrupted by the quality that you're now seeing in mobile phones, but remember handheld GPS devices, right? So the inclusion of maps and GPS, and that replaced an entire category of devices that barely exists anymore. And even just the traditional phone market, right? There were some people that got on board with this idea of Android, but RIM doesn't exist anymore. Nokia doesn't exist in the form that it was a powerhouse. Nokia was the largest manufacturer of mobile phones worldwide. That doesn't exist anymore because they didn't want to get on the Android bandwagon. But they sort of did. That was a complicated series of discussions. They kind of did, but they wanted to get on too aggressively and give us lots of engineers and other things that we in code that we really didn't want. But yeah, that's another thread we could pull on.
So Android is really an operating system on a platform model with apps. Was that how you thought about it early on?
Yeah, and that's all pretty much Andy. He had actually had that app model a bit with Danger, which was that previous company I invested in when I had started Orange Ventures. So Danger had this idea of an app development environment and an app store. One of the problems that Danger had is they didn't get many carriers to adopt that device. They got T-Mobile to adopt the device, and T-Mobile took kind of draconian control of that app store and what could be in it and what couldn't be in it. And Andy didn't want to have anything to do with that as we went into this new world. So we knew we were building open flexible OS. We knew that app developers and apps were going to be important for that. That was the whole reason why very early on, we selected Java as an app development language for third-party apps and some first-party apps. That's why we kind of clean room built a full virtual machine to run, called Dalvik, that ran and executed those Java programs. And the goal was to build something that developers could have, a lot of flexibility in building apps, but also because it was running within that virtual machine, it separated those executing apps from the hardware of the mobile phone, which important stacks that are kind of interacting with the carrier's network or billing and other things. We wanted to make the carrier feel comfortable and ourselves feel comfortable that apps running within that environment weren't going to bring down any important services on the phone to make the phone running, so you could always know that you could call 911, et cetera. And so we had apps, and we had the App Store, originally called the Android Market, cooked in at a very early point when we announced Android, which was about a year before the first phone shipped, but after the iPhone launched. Apple, was just at that same time about announcing and hadn't yet shipped a third-party app development environment. And when we announced Android, we announced it with an emulator and a toolkit for developers to start building apps. So you could basically start building apps for Android right at about the same time that you could start building apps for iOS.
And so how were you thinking about the life of the app developer and the desires of the app developer as a platform developer? I mean, you had developed some apps yourself. How did you know this was going to be a good environment that was going to attract software developers and that they would believe they had a market for their work?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's important to remember, because a lot of people are kind of revisionist in history here. We thought we'd build a decent platform for app developers, right? It's one of the reasons we chose Java as the programming language, is we knew you could walk into, first of all, we didn't choose J2ME, which was one of these previous skinny down versions of Java for mobile development. We wanted full Java programming language because we knew developers could go into the bookstore, grab a book on Java, and that it was a full-featured programming environment. And we thought that was important so that you could build any sort of app you wanted. But remember, back then, even the most wildest projections were going to be that smartphones were going to maybe take 30%, 35% of the overall market eventually. Not the effective 100% that they basically have 99-point-something% of the market now. No one thought that they were going to completely dominate the entire mobile phone space, that they'd replace, for some people, laptop computers and be the primary way that they're getting access to information on the internet. So it was way before then. And nor did people really imagine that there was going to be as explosive a growth of app developers. But we wanted to be as friendly an app platform as possible. That's why day one, anybody could publish an app into the Android market, what's now Google Play. You didn't have to submit it for review in order to get it in. Now, we had a lot of effort to make sure we could do quick takedown if we thought somebody put an app in that was not behaving or malicious, but we made it very easier with little barrier for people to put that app in. It was also a really tough conversation with the carriers because, remember back then, the carriers were king. Who's Google to mobile? You guys aren't mobile. We're mobile. We're Verizon. We're AT&T. We're Vodafone. And so when we would go to them and say, it's going to have an app store, it's not your app store, it's our app store, and any developer can put any app in the phone, they were alarmed because they thought apps were going to take their network down or be malicious. They were going to get all these calls into their customer care. So it was a lot of work to get the carriers to support this idea that it's really good to have apps. It's really good to have as many app developers out there as possible. And something different that we did that Apple didn't do is early on, when we weren't sure if Android was going to take off or not, and we wanted some incentive for this whole idea, is we did rev share with the carriers often on the revenue that was going to be made through the selling of those apps. In fact, we gave the carrier the lion's share of that revenue early on. It's split between the developer and the carrier.
So do you think in addition to being concerned about security and performance, the carriers were concerned that they wanted to have themselves the opportunity to create apps and to develop 100% of that revenue share?
Yeah, they were starting to. They still certainly thought that. I have a book somewhere behind me of Orange's vision for all the apps they wanted to build when I was there, and they had a great vision. And they had an Uber-like app, they had a Spotify-like app in their vision, they had the banking apps. They have a vision video called Orange World where they showed them building all these apps. But the carriers had already been like spending tens of millions of dollars each on their Orange Worlds, right? Or versions of it, where they thought they were going to be the place that consumers were going to want to come to for those services. And I think they were starting to realize by now that maybe they weren't going to build the most innovative apps. Now, they still wanted control. They still would have liked to have had the store. But imagine what it would have been like if, in order to publish, your Travis trying to make this Uber app successful, and you've got to go separately sign contracts with Verizon, Vodafone, AT&T, T-Mobile, US, T-Mobile, Germany, right, Sprint, and the hundreds of carriers around the world. It wouldn't have been tenable. So thankfully, we were able to push back against those not so great instincts of the carriers.
So early on, you're acquired by Google, and the iPhone is emerging down the street. Is there some inflection point in your strategy with Google on where this thing really becomes a big focus for the company?
Yeah, what happened many, many years later, right? So again, go back in time to 2005. There's no whiff of an iPhone, right? The latest innovation, Google at that point was working with carriers to get a search box in the WAP stack. It was called the WAP stack, was this little stack of URLs that carriers had on their feature phones where you could click on something and
Yep.
a very limited set of sites, right? So that was the state of the art in kind of mobile back then, was WAP, and Google just starting to do some search revenue deals with carriers for this search bar that we were putting on these feature phones. What happened was, again, we hadn't even raised any money yet. We weren't trying to sell the company. What happened was we had our VC pitch for Android so we could go raise money. And we were brainstorming, well, how do we get VCs to give us more valuation and think we're sexier than stuff in the phone space, because the phone space isn't that sexy. And we were like, well, what if we could convince a Google or a Yahoo or one of these up and coming internet companies to say, oh, if you build an open mobile phone OS, we could see doing a Google branded phone that we might sell or work with carriers to sell. So all we were doing was looking for a little bit of BD, business development acknowledgement from a Google or a Yahoo to kind of put a little stamp of rub of some of their mojo off on us. When we were talking to VCs, we could mention it. And what happened was Megan Smith, who was at Google at the time, arranged for this meeting. Andy knew her from General Magic, where they had both worked. Andy had been at Davos with Larry Page as in a 30 under 30 group and just sent Larry an email saying we're coming in to pitch. And our VC pitch basically had this thing, to my story earlier about worrying about Microsoft. In our VC pitch, we said there's about 600, 700,000 mobile phones sold every year. And if we don't have Android, Microsoft could own that mobile phone space. And Larry Page at the back of the room was very insightful. And Larry realized that mobile phones were getting to the point where they'd be a computer in everybody's pocket. And this is at a point where Google was kind of putting a lot of money into Firefox because they didn't like IE dominating the browser space way before Chrome. And Larry was like, that sounds like an ambitious goal. Don't you think you need some help? And that was kind of code word for, don't you think we should acquire you? And which we ended up having those conversations, and we walked away, and it was kind of a little, and then we came back to the table. We ended up being acquired by Google. It could fill a book, I think. But anyways, but when we were acquired, we were this little 20% weird research project that, you know, that literally was considered a wild research project that might at some point yield results. There was no strategy. There was no a document that said, here's how we're going to make money from Android. It was just do this acquisition and let's see if we can help these guys build an open mobile phone OS, and maybe good things will come of that.
So you talk about the carriers and you talk about the competition. In terms of manufacturers, are you leaving them out of this description just because they're so tightly linked to the carriers at this point?
No, they were an important part of this whole ecosystem. And so we had, even prior to be acquired by Google, we had been, you know, gone to Seoul and talked to LG and Samsung. We had talked to Motorola. You know, we were talking to the handset OEMs for sure, because we knew that we needed them. We were talking to HTC, was one of our very earliest partners, Peter Chow, who was at HTC at the time. I worked with him at Orange. Andy had worked with him at Danger, talked to him at Danger. So we were very much talking to the handset OEMs. And it's interesting because originally I thought the carriers were going to be the ones who would put their thumbprint on Android and make a Vodafone version of Android and an Orange version of Android and an AT&T version of Android. And they do have their apps, but I think the OEMs were much more savvy and successful at branding, you know, their version of Android as Galaxy, as Droid, right? And putting their own experiences on it, right? Color with OnePlus has their Color OS, which is a version of Android. So no, and in fact, we really, as we started to realize Android was going to be something of a success, or had the potential to be, and we were trying to think about how do we game it to help ensure it's going to be more of a success, one of the things that we decided to do is build this thing called the Open Handset Alliance. And that was us going around and talking to the carriers, to the handset OEMs, to the chip suppliers, to people that were building codecs and other components that were going to be part of the OS, and getting them to join with us in this consortia. So when we announced Android, it wasn't just, wait, why is Google doing something weird in mobile? It was us and, you know, I think about 43 other serious brands and companies that had big presence in the mobile space in all of those different areas. And as a part of them joining, we said, well, carrier, if you join, you have to at least commit and contractually commit that you're going to at least launch one Android handset. OEMs, you have to commit that you're each going to, you know, deliver and launch one handset, and, you know, to the market. We also had all the OEMs sign anti-fragment agreements, right? Because we were building this open source code base, and one of the concerns was, what if LG just, you know, and Samsung take our OS and go in different directions, and we end up with non-compatible versions of the platform because they iterated it. And so we got everybody to agree to not fragment the platform and work with us to keep it as something that, you know, developers could rely on and that would be compatible. So there was definitely a lot of design and gaming going into how we bring not just carriers, but to your point, the handset OEMs and all these other parties to the table, both to give us market cred, help with the shout, and also help build a sustainable ecosystem.
So, question from Bill Acava, one of our faculty, which is very closely related to something I'm interested in hearing about too. You know, Apple has, of course, full control of the hardware on the phone, and Android less so. How does that play out in terms of what you think you can get done or not get done, or how closely you need to work with the OEMs in order to be as fully featured in some ways, or as secure?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that we've been a little bit cyclical on, right? As you said, Apple controls the entire stack. They can optimize everything for that stack, and now they're even doing, you know, for a while they've been doing their own chips and such for that as well. We early on partnered with OEMs. Now we did from a relatively early phase. The first phone, which I have one behind me, it's called the T-Mobile G1. I think I have it in this box. The first phone that was launched by T-Mobile, called the G1, it was a phone that we collaboratively designed, but it was built by HTC. But it had, for instance, a very clever little mechanism. That's the first Android phone right there. It had this little clever mechanism where you could slide it up and get access to a full QWERTY keyboard. And this hinge design is very complicated. You've got a cable in here that has to move while that's sliding and such. And we worked on the design of that hinge mechanism and contracted out to do that piece. And they were building the hardware. So we were early on very tightly a part of the teams that were building the first phones. And for a while, we had this Nexus brand of phones that we would work with other OEMs to do a branded version of a phone that we would collaborate on. And one of the reasons was it just helped with each Android release. If we could have the internal team not only focused on getting the bits out there for everybody in an open source way, but if we had one focused hardware device that we were building towards. But as the question points out, without that complete control of the stack, others doing the lower level system software, drivers and components, we couldn't optimize things top to bottom. And we struggled with how to do that. And we now have, if you see the awards that have recently come out for the 2022 phones, the Google Pixel phone delivered by Google out of a division run by Rick Osterloh, who I know from way back in the early days of Android when he was at Motorola. We're now building amazing hardware. And to the point, we can do things that like Apple can do on this device, so that if you look at reviews of mobile phone cameras, we've had our research team doing a brilliant job at building a digital camera stack. We now have that stack going all the way down to a series of photo sensors that we have tight control over, and camera modules we have tight control over. So we're getting the benefit of being able to, as Google with Android, build a best-in-class device with control all the way down to the hardware. But that's done by a group that we collaborate tightly with, but there's also a wall between the core Android team and that team, so we can also work with all of the other OEMs and and maybe show them, here's how good it can be. Let's help you try and get your hardware as good as what we're able to do with control of that entire stack. But it took many years. It really wasn't until the Pixel 6, the last generation, maybe the Pixel 5, where we really started to excel and see that digital photography stack and some of the other benefits of having that tight vertical integration.
So that's very interesting opportunity to be able to design a phone at Google that's fully integrated. That's one thing Google offers. When you were still thinking about some kind of acquisition, what made you think of Google in the first place?
Well, again, we weren't searching for the acquisition, right? We were searching for that story for the VCs, and what shiny internet company can give us a little bit of glow to get our valuation. And by the way, we did get two term sheets to show you the kind of history. We were a team of experienced entrepreneurs with what seemed like a good idea. We had 2 term sheets for raising $4 million at a $12 million pre, kind of barely seed level prices these days. So the whole reason of talking to Google was really not to get acquired. And in fact, when they did want to acquire us, one of the reasons I said we walked away at one point, one of the reasons we walked away was our concern that mobile phones aren't that important to Google. If they buy us, who's to say that, this was a whim of Larry's to say we should do this? And a year and a half down the road, search revenue becomes the issue, or something else becomes the new shiny, or the Google car, or who knows what, and they decide phones aren't important. And because we won't be controlling our own destiny if we end up being acquired. And remember, I joined in early 2005 after starting to talk to Andy in late 2004. We had just pivoted to phones. We had very little built. And so when we got acquired, we got a little check, but the bigger check came later down the road when we started to deliver lots of phones. And we were concerned, what if Google just decides to not do it? And so anyway, so they weren't the necessary logical choice, but in the conversations, they brought us back to the table, and they had some good things to say about how, basically they just said, look, if you execute, we don't cancel projects where people are doing well. So execute. And we did.
Good incentive. So I have a question from Tim Miller, one of our professors in the Computational Health Informatics program. And by the way, others can put questions into the Q&A down at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So Tim asked, where do you think the revenue was going to come from before this acquisition? What was the model?
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned that before, but we had this razor blade approach where we were going to build the open mobile phone OS that Andy and team were going to do on the West Coast, and we were going to give that away for free, get lots of OEMs building phones, LG, Motorola, Samsung, and others. And then we would go to carriers with a platform, and we were going to sell them that platform and say, because carriers spent a lot of time doing integration work for every new phone they rolled out. And we said, we're going to make your life easy. These phones are all going to have the same OS. We control the OS. We're going to also give you this platform that ties your network really nicely and your services really nicely into that OS, so that you can have that photo album in the cloud, that contact list in the cloud, the ability to download ringtones and wallpapers, personalize the phone. So we were going to sell them that services platform. So as a startup, it was free OS, give a lot of those away, and then a carrier sell of that platform that would connect and light up that OS with a bunch of services that the carrier could control and make money from.
And then once you were acquired, how did Google now think about?
Yeah, once we were acquired by Google, Google wanted to build that open mobile phone OS. They didn't really care about making revenue from a platform selling to carriers. And they, of course, had some services like email and search and other things that they knew they'd be able to put some services onto the phone.
And are you able to talk a little bit about the early competition with Apple and Google as these app store models and phones started to become a thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things in the history there. I held up this phone. A lot of people, we had another phone that we were building prior to this phone that we never launched that looked a lot more like a traditional BlackBerry. It had a screen with a keyboard on it. And we called that phone Sooner. And in parallel with Sooner, we called this phone Dream. This was our dream phone. It could be both touch and have the keyboard, a little bit of kitchen sink. So when Apple launched the iPhone, and we really didn't know other than what we saw in the press. I know Steve Jobs said that Eric had been telling us stuff. We never heard anything from Eric. It wasn't until the iPhone launched that we really knew what it was. And as soon as we saw what it was, Andy made the decision that we should cancel Sooner and focus on Dream. That he just didn't think it made sense for us to have a BlackBerry-like phone when Apple had now, set the standard for what an innovative phone could be like. And so there was a lot of discussion that said we pivoted, we canceled the thing and started from scratch at that point to build a competitive phone with the iPhone. But this was already well underway. I've got renderings of this that I've even shared on Twitter from way before the Apple announcement that we had, the designs for this phone underway. And Apple, it was a little tense because Apple was a partner of Google's, strong partner. We had Maps on that phone, we had Search on that phone, we had YouTube on the iPhone. And so Jobs got a bit upset that we were building a mobile phone OS, but we started it way before they did. He asked us to change some things, like silly things, like your music icon looks too much like our music icon. Like, if you're going to build a music app, you're going to have your music icon be a note, right? in a circle or square.
Right.
In a note, circle, square, so did they. I don't know if you know Android that much, but when you're unlocking an Android screen, you're oftentimes swiping a pattern on the screen that originally could be it was a 3x3 grid where that pattern was. I don't have it on this phone. And that original pattern, you could just swipe sideways and connect 3 dots. But Steve didn't like that because the slider is how you unlock the the iPhone back then. And so he had us make it so you had to connect 4 dots. So you couldn't just do 3 across. You had to do 3 over and 1 down. So, I mean, it was fine. We were happy to make him happy as we could. And again, but when we launched, iPhone was already going pretty strong and starting to prove people wrong. We were the new kid on the block with just this one phone, but it only took 1.5 years to 2 years and we blew past Apple. The big change, it wasn't this phone that did that, but it was when, because T-Mobile was the number 3 carrier in the US, it was when Verizon, the number 1 carrier, launched the Droid phone. And they were very incentivized. I mean, Apple did us a huge favor because if you remember, Apple early on was doing exclusive deals with 1 carrier in each market. So they gave AT&T a 2-year lockup on the iPhone in the US. They gave, I believe it was Vodafone a 1-year lockup in Europe, in the markets where they had, so they were giving these 1-year to 2-year deals. That meant in the US, you had 2 or 3 other carriers, Sprint, T-Mobile, and Verizon, who could not have the iPhone and were desperate to have another smartphone OS. So it created an immediate, even larger market for us to work with all the other carriers to help them and aggressively get Android phones out. They also had their policy around their app store with no rev share. We were willing to talk about rev share on that. Plus on search, we could also do the rev share. So Apple kind of did us a favor in helping, break down some barriers for us, looking more, letting us look a little bit like the good guy. And then it was really Verizon's launch of the Droid phone. They put like $100 million behind an ad campaign. And that both really accelerated things in the US, but also validated Android worldwide because you had the number 1 US carrier really betting on Android as a phone platform.
So a little too exclusive on the early Apple deals.
Yeah, I mean, again, I get why they did that, and I'm sure there were some advantages to them monetarily, but I would say had they not done that, I think they probably would have inhibited more Android growth because, again, if almost 3 out of 4 people are walking into a non-AT&T store to buy a phone and they don't see an iPhone, but they want a smartphone, they're going to buy an Android phone, right? If they could have bought an iPhone, I think you would have had many more iPhones in those first 2-3 years, maybe selling than they did.
So Android has a much bigger global distribution than iPhone. What advantages does that give you in strategy or things that you and Google would like to see happen with Android?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little more democratized. I mean, there were a few things. First of all, even though iPhone had the start and had that top-down stack of hardware development, they only had the features that they put in that one phone, right, each year, and they invested in that 1 year. And so within a couple of years, because there started to be dozens and then hundreds of Android phones launching every year, some of those phones were really low cost, which was great because, again, in the rest of the world and the developing countries, people could go and start to afford to buy a smartphone and be internet connected and get access to the web and information. But it also meant there were high-end phones that 5 other very innovative OEMs could be innovating features. And so it got to a point where within year 3 or 4 of us shipping Android, that there was nothing that was going to come out on the next iPhone that there wasn't already some Android phone that already had it, whether it was fingerprint sensor, stylus support, now it's it's folding screens like with the Samsung, Galaxy Fold and Galaxy Flip. So it's still pretty much the case that innovations happen on Android first. And so what we might have given up a little bit for that tight vertical stack control, I think we gained by helping push the whole industry forward by getting a lot of other mobile innovations happening. And then it also meant that there was going to be a much wider spectrum of price points available, and that certainly helped accelerate Android to get relatively early on, 87+% market share of the smartphone marketplace, because we had that broader distribution, and then combined with that a broader set of and availability of devices and device price points and capabilities.
Is there a signal event that ended up wiping out Windows Mobile, or was it just a slow attrition?
I think it was it never really got to the point where it took off. And I think, it's sort of like when you compare a Surface device to an Android tablet or an iPad, it's too much legacy there that they really struggled to break away from. And that paradigm still was there. It was too PDA and desktop-y like, and it was just harder for it to compete. It never got, capacitive touchscreen was a big thing, and Windows Mobile didn't have that early on. So, one of the fun things for me was, I've told you, one of the primary reasons I started Android was I was worried Windows was going to control the mobile phone space. And here we are today where, this is a Windows device, right? And and it runs Android, right? Or not a Windows device. It's a Microsoft device. Sorry, it's a Microsoft device, and it's running Android, right? And so, so to me, I find it a little bit amusing that that Microsoft ended up adopting basically Android as their mobile phone OS.
Interesting. And you mentioned desktop, and Bill Acava had another question, which is, are there any plans for an Android desktop?
Yeah, well, first of all, I personally think the desktops are dead. I would like to see keyboards in the computer museum. I think the tablet is the new desktop, and the laptop is the new desktop or mainframe. I think you're seeing, with our latest release of Android, and what we've shipped and shown as coming are the multitasking capabilities of tablets, the ability to click in keyboards. You just saw, there's been the Magic Keyboard on iPad, and Lenovo just launched their Extreme tablet, 14-inch tablet at CES with a beautiful click-in keyboard that has a laptop-like feel to it. It's not a flimsy keyboard by any sense. So I think with multitasking and good keyboards, the ability to have stylus-based input, the ability to have apps that are the same apps on that device as your phone, and desktop quality browsers, I actually think there's almost been a crossover point where you're seeing as many tablets shipped per year as laptops. And I think that's going to continue to accelerate, and you're going to see, especially with Google really leaning in now and having announced their first-party tablet, which we have. I think you're going to start to see a shift where, there's potentially fewer laptops than there are tablets, or it's going to benefit the laptop experience, like with Chrome OS, where you can actually run Android apps and have a better together experience between phone and that device. But I don't think you'll see an Android laptop. I think you'll see great Android tablets with great keyboards, and then we've got Chrome OS, and Chrome OS can run Android apps.
So a question from Ashish. And this brings us a little bit into the medical realm. What are your thoughts on add-ons which can transform smartphones to full-featured medical sensors?
Yeah, well, again, this is, I talked about Star Trek early on. We've certainly, the analogy of this is your tricorder, right? Was certainly something we discussed early in the days of Android, that you can imagine it being that. And people have built sensors to test food, to sample sound. So, I mean, I think, well, and you're seeing these being used as medical devices for ocular, and do eye exams and other things, right? So to look at dermatological issues and skin issues, right? You should be able to use these to give you posture feedback and information and PT support. So I think, this is what Larry was, believing it could become. It is the computer in your pocket, way more powerful than computers were just 3 or 4 years ago. The fastest laptops were 3 or 4 years ago. So the ability for these to tie in to not only the sensors that they have, which are pretty significant between accelerometers and MEMS and compasses and the cameras, but then also to have other peripherals either physically connect or Bluetooth or BLE connect to these devices, certainly for field work, is something that's already happening.
So you started 2 corporate venture funds. You've worked with or raised money from dozens of others. What's the difference between a traditional VC, a corporate VC? What are you learning in the VC world? You've got a lot more experience in innovation and success than most VCs. What are you learning?
Yeah, I mean, well, from a corporate venturing standpoint, I certainly learned a lot from my first fund, which we did at Orange, and then what we did at GV. And I'd say that the traditional corporate venture fund is typically not the smartest beast, right? You'll see historically, companies decide to get into venture when they feel like they're missing out because everybody's making a bunch of money and they decide to create their fund to get into it, which they typically end up getting formed right around the peak, only to have things crash and then decide maybe we should pull back from our venture fund. They also focus significantly on strategic venturing, which isn't a bad thing. There are places where strategic funds are very valuable to help startups, especially at the later stage, right? When you're going from early drug discovery to trials or other things. Maybe you want to get some strategic money in from a large pharma that's going to be interested in helping you out or taking you to market later down the road. Or but the problem is corporate venture funds that are strategic aren't great for entrepreneurs often, and certainly not early in this cycle. Because if you take strategic money, that strategic money invested because of that last pitch they saw, that they really like the direction you're going in and it aligns with their corporate strategy. And if you decide you need to pivot, that's not working for us, we're going to go this way. These guys are like, no, we invested in you for this. We want to pull you back to this way that maybe you're going to crash as a successful, big, huge company, but you're going to deliver the widget that we need. Mm-hmm. And so with GV, we were very focused on building something that was going to be a best-in-class, top-tier, high return, early stage to late stage venture capital fund that was focused on financial returns. And our thesis was, if you could leverage Google brand and Google smarts, see all the problems that Google sees, see the innovations that Google sees, see the challenges that Google is looking for solutions for, and have those optics, but be a fund that's not beholden to that and simply invest in the best entrepreneurs, the best companies that you thought could have the best returns, you would end up investing in a nest that Google would end up acquiring, right? So we actually believe we've been able to be strategically beneficial to Google, and there have been a handful of acquisitions that Google has done out of our portfolio that were value and beneficial for the company and for the acquired company as well as for Google. But we've also, have generated phenomenal returns for the fund as well, because we structured ourselves, compensated the partners, and organized ourselves as a traditional non-strategic venture fund. And that also let us get into those early deals. It let us convince a Tony Fadell, who had built the first iPhone and the first iPod and was not, could raise money from anybody, to take a Series A from Google Ventures, now TV.
So for our young people, we've got a question from Xingyu Liu, a PhD student from UMass Lowell. How can I combine research with product? How can I build a startup from the start as a student after graduation? Is idea, team, or money the most important?
Team out of that list, certainly, right? I mean, and by team, that doesn't mean that you have to have an experienced team, right? Smart team, driven team, hopefully diverse team. But VCs tend to invest in people. Ideas are a little cheaper than really good, focused, driven teams. Now, you still need to have the thing that you're going to compel people towards, that your team is going to be building. That could be based on some of the coolest breakthrough tech. It could be based, most of my startups, Wildfire and Android, weren't so much the coolest breakthrough tech as well as several maturing technologies coming together. In the case of Android, battery, capacitive, touchscreen, higher speed mobile networks, low power processors, all of those things coming together at the right time and right place, so you could build a smart computer that can fit in your pocket and be wireless. So you still need that idea, hopefully solving some problem that people have, a problem that either a huge number of people have, and you can make it up in pennies for that huge number and make a good business, or an idea that maybe it's a much smaller market, but has higher value that you can charge for to make your business. But anyways, key question, I'd say, really focused on finding at least one other, if not two other co-founders. Try and make sure that you have a balance of some good product sense and some good technical sense. And again, that doesn't mean that you need an MBA and a tech person, but somebody who, because I've seen very good, technically educated people that have great product sense. In fact, Google, most of its product managers, certainly early on, were people that had a CS degree and then an MBA. But I think you want to have both product intuition and sense and technical DNA in that initial founding team.
Question from Alex Butler, a resident at Boston Children's in pediatrics. In your experience, what's the biggest barrier to tech innovation in the healthcare space? If you have any a line of sight into this, if not, we can give it to you at some point. But for example, that have been widely embraced throughout healthcare are not up to speed in a technology sense.
Yeah, I think there's two. From my, again, I sat around the table when we evaluated life science-based investments, but it's not my domain of expertise. But what I see is the two barriers. One is on the PII, information sharing and privacy rights and data movement, right? The fact that I, as a user, have to cryptically log into N different systems to try and come up with my own composite image of my own health record, let alone have some system be able to crunch that data and make smart decisions based on it, is clearly one barrier. The other is the regulatory space in which you operate, right? Like I can put a release of software on this that spins the CPU at such a high rate that it burns up the phone or CPU or some other component because the phone got so hot and whatever. But you do that to somebody's liver, and that's not as good an outcome. And so the rate at which you can test things on your target population is limited as well. Now there are people that are building information models and systems that let you start to run trials and tests that have genetic and other data sets that let you do testing at scale. So people are trying to figure out how to solve that problem and let you do drug trials and other things on simulated populations of people. But anyways, those seem to be the two. It's not for lack of smart people lots of good ideas and other things that you can do. But those seem to be two of the bigger barriers.
Do you have any advice, and this is from Venkamurthy, on sparking more innovation and sort of app stores that connect to our, our physician-facing systems so that we can provide much more functionality and innovation getting to the point of care? Right now, as I've described to you, our team has developed 2 APIs that are in the law and the enforcement begins 2 weeks ago, December 31st, 2022. So there's an opportunity to connect apps for patients to electronic health records. Are there, and so this is really the first moment when we can begin to advertise that to a world of technology developers. Before it was promised, like in the future, you can connect everywhere, but now it's really in the interoperability laws and in the technologies. How do you get that ecosystem kindled?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways, and I think there are a lot of analogies, right? I mentioned this Open Handset Alliance, and I think you're doing this, right? Get it, first of all, take a platform approach, get that platform standardized and codified in a way is important. Get as many high brand entities, hospitals, research hospitals, insurance companies, pharma companies, and others supporting that platform and saying good things about it in ways that people realize, oh, if we build something, it seems like there's market for it and ways to go to market for it. Recruit, right? Recruit some high valued people and start building yourself, hopefully some shining examples. That tends to have a little bit of a gamble because, like any startup, you pick 5 startups, it's likely those 5 don't make it. You pick 10, maybe you get 1, right? So you have to pick and choose some apps, but start building apps on top of that platform. And hopefully some of them, certainly just for examples of how you do it, you need that anyways. To do some of the basics, you need that. But, maybe try and invest and incentivize some top companies with some top products to do things. The other thing I'd consider is, when we did this, it's been kind of, the kind of X Prize model or prize model. One of the things that we did early with Android before this first phone shipped, we had the Android Developer Challenge. So we had shipped our simulator and APK and development tools, and we had a couple $1 million that we put together, and we had competitions where we would award lots of small and medium-sized checks to people that built the best apps. And it turns out that, a research team with the idea that they could win $100,000, right, or $50,000, you get a lot of research teams competing for that. And that ends up creating a lot of innovation. It gets you a lot of developers and researchers at research hospitals familiar with your APIs so that they can, take that knowledge and bring it into other companies when they're hired and recruited. So I think that's another, I think it worked well for us early in Android. I still have people literally that come up to me today that, are on their 3rd, 4th job professionally that say, you judged our app, that we built at MIT when I was a student there.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It reminds us to try it again. A decade ago, more than a decade ago, we had an app challenge that the White House encouraged us to do when we were federally funded. We're still federally funded, but when this was a very big federal project. And Anish Chopra, who was Obama's chief technology officer, blogged about this on the whitehouse.gov site. And we had Tufte as one of the judges, and people wanted to get their innovations in front of him. And Regina Herzlinger from the business school, people really wanted to get in front of those judges, and it was great. And it actually did achieve all those things. So it's a great reminder that this is a moment to potentially get back
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, $1 million, a lot of money, but in kind of this sense, it's not necessarily a lot. $1 million, that's $500,000 checks and $10,000, $50,000 checks, right?
Right.
And that can go a long way to motivate people.
So as we wrap up, there's a few questions here from Usman Sattar and Alan Wolf and others about the future. What's the future of these things? What does mobile look like in the 2030s? What is what are the opportunities to really innovate now? Where should people be looking?
Yeah, I've mentioned a couple of things. So I think one direction, I think there's a couple of very different directions. One direction is kind of more atomized, lightweight, and distributed, where we already see mobile headsets shrinking, right? Smartwatches, right? And we're just starting to see that you're at the point, the new Pixel watch, you can be out running, leave your phone at home, have your earbuds in, and still take a phone call, listen, stream your music, and do other things, and not have to have your phone. So the kind of taking of your phone and having it become, more a series of accessories on you as opposed to the monolithic device, I think is one direction. I think also, they're still relatively new, but I'm a big believer in foldables because you can go from, instantly go from a phone in one moment to effectively a tablet in another moment. And I think that that's a great form factor as well. I do think that the phone platforms, I think Apple and Google have an advantage with their tablets over, say, a Microsoft, in that there are a lot of people that just want their productivity platform and their phone to be the same and to feel the same and to have the same apps. And so I think the fact that, Android tablets, iOS tablets are based on that, have their DNA and the similarities with their mobile phone platforms. I do think tablets become that compute platform. I'm a huge believer in digital ink and stylus. I mentioned I'd like the keyboard to go away. The reason I'd like the keyboard to go away is most people who are thinking and designing and you're trying to come up with a new molecule, let's say, you're trying to come up with a new medical device. A lot of time that starts with sketching and outlining and some bullet points as to what you want that thing to look like. And I actually think we do a disservice starting when kids are in third grade, when we start taking the pencils and crayons out of their hands and giving them this, and going from nonlinear, like anywhere on a canvas, an idea, a sketch, a drawing, and where words and drawings are equal citizens on that canvas, and having them go into a hunt and peck, sequentializing all their ideas that they have into, no, where's the K? Where's the E? Where's the E, P, right? Like, how does that help your imagination and dreaming and ideation? And so in my world, you never put this down. You go from crayon on a screen where maybe you're drawing a tree and your digital friend in the tablet knows it's a tree, to maybe turning everybody into Leonardo da Vinci, that you draw your idea, right? And Einstein, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison would draw, a patent idea out and then had an entire room of draftsmen he would hand that sketch to, who would clean it up and make it ready for a patent application or a financing pitch. What if we give everybody that capability, that you just scribble on your tablet, kind of a combination of thought to pen to DALL-E, generative, output, right? If you can connect that pipeline together where you're collaborating with that screen that's with you everywhere by just jotting a note down or a quick sketch, and that can quickly turn into a shareable artifact that you're proud of because it gets magically cleaned up and your spelling gets corrected for the bullet points around it, whatever. So I think there's for me, this idea of enterprise assistant, not your daddy's Clippy, Microsoft Clippy, but a kind of new form of enterprise assistant, I think is a very compelling vision.
All right. We will leave it there with a very inspiring vision. Thank you, Rich, for spending the time with us, for answering questions from our faculty, our students, our listeners and colleagues from around the country and the world on the Zoom with us today. And we really hope to tap you on the shoulder and learn more soon. So really appreciate it. I'm going to wrap up with a view of what's coming up next in our series. Thank you very much again, Rich.
Great, thanks for the time.
So for folks just pointing to upcoming talks, one pretty soon, Alan Brandt, who is a leading historian of medicine and science, a university professor at Harvard, absolutely fantastic speaker. Ron Balliser, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at Clalit, who brought to us many of the studies using real-world data of around the Pfizer vaccines most recently, and is driving towards a learning health system. Julie Gerberding, former CDC director, Karen Copenhaver, legal counsel at Linux, Robert Langer, most cited engineer in history, Ian Lipkin, a renowned virus hunter, Tom Mayer, who has done tremendous innovation as medical director at the NFL Players Association, Molly Ann Brody, who directs public opinion and survey research at Kaiser Family Foundation, and is the one who, when you see a medical statistic about people's views quoted in the news, it's often her. Toby Cosgrove, a storied CEO from the Cleveland Clinic, and Christina Farr, now a venture capitalist and formerly an extremely well-known technology and health reporter at CNBC. So the Children's Computational Health Informatics Program at Boston Children's Hospital very much looks forward to hearing from folks on this Zoom, to seeing you on the future Landmark Idea series. And thank you very much. Have a terrific afternoon.